off by talking about the enormously helpful contribution of a feminist perspective into anthropology. As we discussed in the last section, early anthropologists were interested in the ideas of how people related to each other and kinship. They basically assumed, as we saw, they assumed that these things about human reproduction and care were going to be universal, and as such, basically assumed what we call heteronormativity, that most people in the world were going to have women and men getting together to reproduce. And so if you look at the early kinship charts of the anthropologists, there's all these triangles to indicate males, with marriages to circles to indicate females, and then they'd have smooth lines of descent between them. Some of the most famous early anthropologists, a couple of names that we've mentioned, Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, were early on advocating for understanding a wider spectrum of human behavior than had traditionally been acknowledged. But for the most part, early anthropologists were again assuming the kinds of male-female relationships that we have assumed in Euro and North American societies. Like we said, what they found was a rather dizzying array or variety of different ways that people made kinship and did marriage. We'll talk about different marriage forms in the next class, and constructed their families and who was related to whom. And one of the things that I think they found is, we think we're all up on our male-female binary kinds of stuff, and we think we're getting new ideas being brought into our own society. But I guess I would say that if you want to look back at what people were doing hundreds or thousands of years ago and in different kinds of societies, if you think what we're doing is weird, people were doing weirder stuff at different times. We're in some ways, the whole idea of, say, doing an operation on somebody's it's too early in the morning for this. Doing operations on somebody's genitals, people have been doing that for a long time and in much more painful ways than we do it now. So whatever's going on today, people have been doing something stranger back then. The contribution of feminism to this, starting in the 1970s, is they took all those things that, people were saying, oh, well, I think that I have two fathers or something like that. And they said, look, people can be very different in different societies. Is our society the only way to organize things? When we look at the relationships between men and women and the power dynamics of men and women, does it have to be that way? And indeed, in many societies, there are power dynamics between males and females, but we find a vast variety of the ways in which those relationships are constructed. And so the contribution of people who started to rethink the kinship charts and who is related to whom and what it means to be a mom, dad, or something else, contributed a lot to us opening up our minds to different possibilities of organizing the world. In particular, the feminists gave us a distinction between the word sex and the word gender. And this is something that unfortunately is becoming a bit blurred today. So I just want to say that when anthropologists and many other social scientists use these two words, they mean to distinguish between what we might call the biological differences, the genetics, the hormones, the physiology. That is what we call sex. What we call gender, meant one more animation in there, but What we call gender is all the things that we load onto those perceived differences. So the idea that boys should wear blue and behave in a certain way, and that girls should wear pink and play with different toys, and that women should talk in a certain way and shouldn't be doctors, and all these kinds of ideas and roles and expectations are the things that we put on and load onto society. So in what the feminists were able to do was to go out and say, well, look, here in one society, they assume that only men should be weaving. And if you go over this other society, they assume that only women should be weaving. So it's obviously not sort of biologically built in that only men can weave or only women can weave. Although if you go to that society, they'll tell you it is. They'll tell you that, no, women can't do this. They can't weave. And then you go to this other society and you're like, wait a second, they're doing all the weaving here. So we have all these gender expectations which we build in, and these change over time. So 100 years ago, I'm told that it was the girls who were supposed to wear blue because blue was seen as a more female cooling color, and little boys wore pink because they're eventually supposed to grow into the red, hot, masculine color. So it's been completely reversed in our own society as well. Now, my note here is that this is the way anthropologists and social scientists think about things, that is to say, distinguishing between what are biological characteristics of sex and our social expectations, which is gender. But in popular culture, people like the word gender better than they like the word sex, probably because people don't want to say sex. And so you'll often hear the word gender used incorrectly to indicate what should be indicated as biological sex. My best example of this is the gender reveal party. So we can do an ultrasound, right? You go in and you peer and you get a close look at what the genitals, what you think the genitals are going to be, and then you throw a big party. Usually I only hear about these because somebody has shot a cannon out and burned something down, or somebody has died. I wouldn't really recommend these. They're kind of scary. But the idea is we're going to have a gender reveal party, and we're going to tell us what the gender of the infant is. Technically, these should be called sex reveal parties. They're not revealing the gender, they're revealing a biology. But if you called them sex reveal parties, you get a whole different crowd, right? That would be because, of course, sex has a couple different meanings. Oh, there's that ... just to, blur the meaning in your mind, just in case. All right, so sex and gender. Now, in our society, we have generally, in the olden days, the census, you had to mark off whether you were male or female. In fact, on the census, that was something the census taker could do. Didn't even have to ask you what gender you thought you were, and there were only 2 boxes. However, in other societies, there may be more than 2 different gender categories. We saw this a little bit, we talked about this a little bit back with those archaeological artifacts, and the ideas of what is a prehistoric male or a prehistoric female. There's many different names, of course, for these categories in other societies. A lot of these societies were actually indigenous to the Americas. Their people were very persecuted by French and Spanish and colonizers. But basically, the idea was that there were people who might be biologically male or biologically female, but would take upon the social roles of the other gender, or they would have their own special role in society. And so you could have 3rd or 4th gender categories. In some indigenous American groups today, they are trying to, in part, go back to some of these things. And one of the designations that they've come up with is that is kind of more akin to what they would be called in a traditional society as a two-spirit peoples that have both genders, you might say. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that there's any biological sex difference, but there's a special gender role. We'll talk a little bit more about sexuality in the next class, but I would just say that in this case, these people would often engage in what we might classify as homosexual activities. They're having same-sex activities, but they didn't necessarily identify as homosexual, gay, lesbian in the way that people do today. In fact, the idea of identifying, well, let me put it this way. Homosexual activities have gone on all across all kinds of societies from time immemorial, and actually a lot of times in the animal world as well. But the idea that you are something, that you take that on as an identity, is actually a fairly recent idea. And you can see that if you have three genders, then the whole idea of being hetero or homosexual is kind of thrown into question, because that's kind of depends upon itself upon a gender binary. Over the years, there was a good film on PBS called Two Spirits, and they did a map of all the different places that have different ideas that there are more than two genders. Again, this is us talking about gender, social roles and expectations. It doesn't necessarily mean that there is a biological or sex modification going on. So these societies can be found on every continent in different places. Again, lots of different names and ideas for how people do this. Now, I wanted then to extend this out a little bit, because a lot of people are probably okay with going beyond the gender or the social binary. We can kind of wrap that into our mind, because that's the expectations that you have that are based on biology. But this article is kind of, it's a little bit, I guess I would say it's a little bit out there. I'm not necessarily sure I'm even completely there yet. Well, Juliana, what would you say is the point of this article? What's the big boom part?
It was just saying that, like, our body really felt what we think, and like it says that research.
All right, so our bodies are more complicated than we think. Now, like I said, a lot of people are fine with the gender being on a spectrum, but this is kind of starting to say, well, wait a second. Is sex, biological sex, also a little more complicated than we think? Now, let's see. Wait a second. Nicole, what did you learn about identifying biological sex? It's not as easy as you'd think. Yeah, here's a too close look at a couple of pelvises that I got from textbook I'll use in the next version of this course. As you can see, if you look really carefully, there's not one distinguishing feature. There are some things that are characteristically different if you're trained to do this, but it's not as easy to identify as one might think based on the exterior anatomy. The pelvises are not as easy to classify. And so, as it says in the article, it turns out people were classifying archaeological pelvises that, you know, they'd have like 12% more males than females. Now, Evan, what happens when they went back and figured this out?
So
kind of started to even out the way it probably should have been, right? Which is more like 50-50 because they were over classifying the males. We're also now saying that some are kind of, we don't know, they're indeterminate. We don't know what they are. So the big issue here, or the big question is it our strict ideas, the social ideas that gender comes as a binary, which has made us so insistent that sex is also a binary? And again, I'll leave that a little bit open because this is a little bit out there. I think some people are willing to go with the social gender stuff, but saying sex is not a binary is like a little bit tricky. Now, it's tricky for us because in the old days, if someone were born with what we call intersex characteristics, the doctors would huddle and then they'd like fix them. They'd try to fix them out the way they thought they should be. And so there is a intersex community that is arguing that, hey, let's not do operations so fast. I mean, there are some cases where there is a kind of obviousness to it, but other people have argued, hey, let's let the child be for a little bit before you try and fix it. For me, I think this is clear that however much you want to go with spectrum or binary, it's definitely not as clear cut as we once imagined it was. It's definitely messier than it was. My own personal view is that there's still a lot of binariness to sex, but it's not as much as we once assumed. If you look at the World Health Organization on gender and genetics, I mean, I think that the figure of 1.7% intersex characteristics for babies might be a little bit on the high side. This is what the World Health Organization put it for, say, just chromosomal difference that, you know, of births that XXY is at about 0.2%. etc. So a lot of these people are born maybe with an extra or a different chromosome and live out their lives and are fine. It's not that they're messed up or anything, but you know, it's just, like I said, it's messier than we thought. These issues are going to be complicated and they're obviously they've always been with us. We haven't always recognized them and they're going to be with us. And I think that it's helpful to engage in what Herdy called some compassion and empathy as we approach these issues. So again, I'm not asking you to believe that sex is a spectrum, but I think that I think that both gender and sex is not as clear cut as we once imagined it to be. And in other societies, we see lots of examples of people doing it differently.